Great inventions are rarely done in one go. Instead, they come in a string of small steps, and crediting a single person with creating an innovation as a modern audience would recognise it is hard to do, as is the case with the railways. The question of who created the tracks the trains would eventually run on heavily depends on how one defines tracks. As far back as ancient Egypt, pyramid builders recognised that a heavy load is easier to move along a smooth surface, and that it is easier to create two raised strips of smooth stone to support their loads than to smooth over the entire route. The first roadway, specially shaped to guide vehicles, was built around 600 BC in Dylakos in Greece. Grooves were cut in limestone blocks to guide trucks, which were used to transport ships across the Isthmus of Corinth. But the first recorded route, with raised wooden rails and specially built vehicles to run on it, was built in Germany in 1556. The carts ran on two central rails, with a spike between them to guide them along. In 1568, German miners created Britain's first known wagonway, as a means of helping them transport coal. The idea slowly spread all over Europe, wherever goods needed regularly transporting to the nearest market or dock, using a variety of methods to hold them on the wooden rails, and various combinations of horses, winches and gravity to guide them along. With rails to run on, the horses could pull 4 times the weight it was possible to pull on roads. With the Industrial Revolution, iron became easier to manufacture, and wagonways began covering their wooden rails with iron sheets in order to reduce wear as well as friction, allowing them to pull more weight still. In 1801, the Surrey Ironway opened between Wandsworth and Croydon, the first public railway, in that anyone who had a vehicle that could run on the tracks was allowed to do so for a certain fee. In 1807, the first properly organised passenger services began on the Swansea Wagonway in Wales. Benjamin French, one of the proprietors of the line, built the world's first station platform in Oystermouth as a means of transporting passengers to Swansea. However, for the passengers of these early wagonways, there was no clear advantage in speed over the roads and the canals. Indeed, the wagonway was soon replaced by a turnpike road that was built not long afterwards. To properly revolutionise society, the wagonways would need something to power the passengers along at a greater speed. That something was steam power. The history of the earliest steam engines is surprisingly almost as far back as the tracks they would eventually run on. The first working steam engine was built by Hero of Alexandria around AD 62. Hero built a copper ball mounted on 2 hollow casters, through which steam would be fed from a reservoir heated from the fires below. Pressure would build up until the steam would shoot out of 2 angled nozzles, causing the ball to spin at great speed. Sadly, Hero never thought to put this to practical use. Even if he had, any hope of kick-starting an industrial revolution 1,700 years early would require a quantity of strong material, fuel and specialisation that were not available at the time. Hero's engines, as they are now known, produced very little traction. To make use of it, the Romans would either have to gear it down a lot or use it to drive ships' propellers, and neither gears nor propellers existed at the time. Hero's engine was doomed to be no more than a novelty for more than 1,000 years. The first steam engine to be of practical use was built by a vicar called Thomas Newcomon in 1712. It was built to act as a pump to draw water out of a local tin mine. However, instead of using steam pressure to drive the cylinder, as one might expect, he did the opposite. A counterweight would be used to lift the cylinder, drawing steam into the boiler. The valve through which the steam entered would then be shut off, sealing the cylinder. Water would then be injected in, rapidly cooling the steam and causing it to contract, sucking the cylinder down, thus driving the machine. Newcomon built around 150 of these engines to serve as pumps in mines. They allowed miners to dig deeper than ever before, but they were also heavy coal guzzlers. Fortunately, most of the mines that bought them would mine in coal anyway. In 1763, a man called James Watt was tasked with repairing a Newcomon's engine. He noted several inefficiencies, which he began to improve upon. First, he saw that the cylinder was having to be heated and cooled with each stroke, causing much of the heat energy to be lost into the body of the cylinder. To get around this, he invented the condenser. Instead of water being injected into the cylinder, a valve would be opened, whereupon convection currents would draw the steam down into a low-pressure condenser, drawing the cylinder down with it. The steam would be cooled in the condenser and fed back into the boiler. The condenser was immersed in cooling water, and the cylinder encased in insulating material in order to keep each at a constant temperature. Watt also replaced the chains of Newcomon's engine with rods, allowing the cylinder to push as well as pull and allowing it to drive wheels. Watt also noted that Newcomon's engine used sucking force to draw the cylinder down, which meant that the driving force of the machine was never more than atmospheric pressure. He improved upon this by injecting low-pressure steam above the cylinder during downward strokes. In later years, he would develop a system that would allow the cylinder to be double-acting, with each side alternatively having steam injected and condensed. However, the steam pressure he could employ was barely above atmospheric due to safety concerns, and the suction from the condensing steam would remain the main driving force of the engine. Watt's engine could provide the same power output as a similarly sized Newcomon's engine, but required half the coal to run. After partnering with Matthew Boulton in 1775, they were able to sell his engines around the country, and soon the world, completely revolutionising many industries. Many wagonways employed these engines to act as winches, to help pull carts over tougher sections of track. Having devised a means of turning a wheel with a steam piston, the next obvious thing to do would be to use the wheel to drive a vehicle. A French engineer called Nicolas Joseph Cognot was granted funding from King Louis XV to do just that. In 1769, he built a test model, which he named the Fardier A Vapor. A year later, he built a full-size version, capable of carrying 4 passengers. This was the world's first self-propelled vehicle. However, it proved unstable and not as powerful as the king had hoped, and funding was soon withdrawn. An engineer working for Watt, known as William Murdoch, heard about Cognot's work and decided to build his own. In 1784, he built a 30cm high model to prove his concept, which he named the steam locomotive. His model worked pretty well, but he was never able to secure the funding to build a full-size version, few seeing the viability of the idea. The problem was, low-pressure steam engines tended to be bulky and produced barely enough power to move their own weight, nowhere near enough to be put to practical use. However, when the Napoleonic Wars began in 1792 and dragged on for the best part of 22 years, many horses were withdrawn from the country for the war effort. There was now a shortage of them, and suddenly a vehicle to run on the tracks seemed like a great idea if somebody could produce one. The challenge was to create a high-pressure engine of some kind, but to do so would require the whole system to contain the pressure without bursting. The solution came from Murdoch's next-door neighbour, Richard Trevithick. He replaced the square boiler with a round one. This allowed the pressure to spread more evenly, and the boiler could take more without bursting. Trevithick also had the idea to run a pipe through the boiler, carrying smoke from the fire. This brought the heat right to the heart of the tank, and boiled the water much more efficiently than just lighting a fire underneath. Finally, he modified the cylinder itself. Some of his engines could produce a pressure 10 times higher than any of Watt's engines. This meant that the cylinders could be much smaller and therefore lighter. As the high-pressure steam was now the main driving force, it was no longer necessary to condense the steam, and doing so was actually slowing down the rate at which the cylinder could be evacuated. Instead, in Trevithick's engines, the steam would be vented out into the atmosphere. Trevithick's first thought was to build a steam carriage with this technology. Unfortunately, the delicate balance of cylinders and flywheels made suspending the carriage impossible, and on the cobbles of London, it proved a very bumpy ride for the passengers. The next logical move was to run his vehicle on rails instead. In 1802, he installed one of his high-pressure engines in Pen-y-Darran Ironworks in Methotydril to drive a hammer. During a lull in installation, he experimented with building a vehicle to run on the mine's tracks. This impressed the owner, who made a bet with another ironworks owner that the machine could pull 10 imperial tons of iron from Pen-y-Darran to Abercynon, 16 kilometres away. Trevithick managed it, pulling not only the iron, but also 70 passengers over the course of 4 hours and 5 minutes. This was the first ever run of a steam train. However, the weight of the engine caused so much damage to the wooden rails that it was never used for this purpose again. Trevithick built at least 4 locomotives, which went to work on various wagonways. In 1808, he opened a steam fair in London to show off his invention to investors and the public. His train, known as Catch Me Who Can, ran round on a ring at speeds of 19 kilometres an hour, with the public invited to race against it. This time he used iron rails, which would be strong enough to support the train. Unfortunately, the ground beneath the sleepers was not. Some of the sleepers sank, putting strain on the rails and eventually bending them out of shape. After a bit of trial and error, the track was repaired and shored up, but by then the public excitement had died down, and few were willing to pay the shilling entry fee. Trevithick had spent all of his savings on the fair, and its financial failure pretty much put an end to his railway schemes. What's more, Napoleon surrendered in 1814, and again in 1815. Now that workhorses were readily available again, and locomotives had yet to produce a clear advantage over them, the nation's wagonways simply returned to using them. Progress slowed for a while. Nonetheless, engineers continued to tinker with locomotives, in the hope that they could realise their potential. Among them was George Stephenson, who installed several locomotives on the Hetton Colliery Railway. The inland mines in County Durham were looking for an easy way of transporting coal to the markets in Darlington and the port of Stockton. Several canals had been proposed, but each ran into too many logistical issues. A final canal proposal in 1821 would have bypassed the main mining towns. A Welsh engineer called George Overton was called in to consult. He suggested building a wagonway instead. The line's main investor, Edward Peace, liked the idea, but doubted Overton's ability to realise it. He appointed George Stephenson as the chief engineer. Stephenson recommended the use of steam locomotives on the line. By now, some of his experimental locomotives had proved an ability to pull much more weight than horses ever could. He recommended that the route be built using malleable rolled iron rails to make them strong enough to take the extra weight. This despite the fact that he had shares in cast iron manufacturing. Early steam locomotives would struggle on all but the slightest hills and bends. To connect 2 points, a route would have to be created that was as straight and level as possible. A huge army of workmen, known as navigational engineers or navvies, was assembled to level the ground and create a smooth straight run. Fortunately, the navvies were well experienced in creating long level routes, having been digging canals for generations. The best teams could move more than 2,000 tons of rock and soil a day. Soil removed from a cutting in one section of the line was used to build up the ground in another. Where the valley was too deep, a viaduct was built. Health and safety being largely non-existent at the time, accidents and even fatalities were common among the workers. By 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway was complete. Stephenson's locomotion number 1 was positioned at Shildon Lane End for the first proper train journey. It pulled behind 12 wagons of coal and 21 wagons that had been fitted with seats enough to take 300 people, but 450 turned up for the inaugural journey, many of whom would cling to the outside of the trucks or climb on top of the coal. The train set off, with a huge crowd attempting to follow on both horse and foot. but the train soon picked up speeds of 19 kilometres an hour, leaving the crowds behind. Even those on horseback couldn't keep pace. On the uphill sections, it would slow to 4 kilometres an hour. The journey wasn't smooth, and the train would have to stop twice for repairs on the way, but after 3.5 hours, they reached Darlington, where a huge cheering crowd greeted them. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was the first to run passenger services under steam, but it was not a proper railway as we'd recognise it today. Though there were some passenger services, the line was run more like a public road. Anyone with a vehicle capable of running on the rails could do so for a reasonable price. Most of these vehicles were still horse-drawn. The first fully timetabled railway was still a few years away. Stephenson, meanwhile, was improving on the designs of his engines, trying to see if he could coax a bit more power out of them, assisted by his son Robert. First, he looked at the smoke running through the boiler, and replaced the single large pipe with lots of small ones, increasing the surface area in contact with the water, and allowing the water between the pipes to be superheated, thus speeding the rate at which it would boil. Next, he looked at the exhaust steam. Instead of venting it straight into the atmosphere, he piped it into the chimney. This had the effect of drawing smoke up the chimney faster and drawing more air into the fire, thus allowing it to burn much hotter and boil more water. Finally, he took the vertical cylinders of previous engines and placed them at an angle. This allowed a better balance when transferring force to the wheels. He dubbed his new creation the Rocket. The Rocket would soon get a chance to be seen in action. The Lancashire mills depended heavily on materials imported through Liverpool, but the roads used to transport them inland were of varying quality. There were several canals, but they were becoming congested by this time. It was said that it was faster to send goods from Liverpool to New York than to Manchester. What's more, the canal owners had gained a monopoly on the transport, and the prices they were charging were strangling the industry. With the population in need of an alternative, a railway was proposed. The founders of the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway knew from the start that it should be steam-powered, but they were undecided about whether to run locomotives or to install a series of steam winches along the line. To see if any engine would be up to the job, a trial was held at Rain Hill, where a 2.8 kilometre stretch of track was built. Entrants would have to make 10 trips back and forth to simulate the distance they would have to cover along the completed line. They would also have to average at least 16 kilometres an hour as they went. More than 10 trains were entered, but only 5 were able to turn up for the competition. But Stephenson's Rocket was the only one to complete the entire course, averaging 19 kilometres an hour and hitting a top speed of 48. Between Liverpool and Manchester were a series of hills, valleys, bogs and landowners, all of which would need to be overcome. After much debate and redesign, a route was planned and construction got underway. At Sankey Brook Valley, Stephenson designed one of the largest viaducts in the world at the time, 217 metres long, 18 metres high, and with arches 15 metres wide. To avoid smashing through Liverpool itself, a 2-kilometre tunnel was dug under the city, the first tunnel ever to run under a major city. Probably the biggest challenge faced was at the extensive bog at Chat Moss. Here, rock and soil was poured in from other parts of the line to create a causeway 3 kilometres long. Finally, in 1830, the railway was ready. The first fully timetabled steam passenger railway in the world. Its inaugural run saw the Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, in attendance. He had his own special train to carry him, with 6 other trains running in the inaugural procession. The trains set out from Liverpool. At the halfway point, the Duke's train had to stop at Parkside to take on water. At this time, many of the passengers ignored instructions from the crew and got out to stretch their legs. The MP for Liverpool, William Huskisson, was stood on the tracks talking to Wellington through his carriage window, when the passengers realised that the rocket was now making its way along the track they were stood on, and they quickly began scrambling out of the way. Huskisson tried to climb into the Duke's carriage, but as he tried to pull himself up by the door handle, the door came open and he fell under the wheels of the rocket. He would die from his injuries later that day. Huskisson was far from the first to die on the railways, not even the first passenger. A blind American beggar, whose name was never found out, had died on the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1827, but Huskisson was the first to be widely reported. Wellington wanted to cancel the rest of the day's events and return to Liverpool, but was persuaded to carry on, as it was seen as important that his train arrive in Manchester to prove the concept. However, as they approached Manchester, they were stopped by an angry mob. Wellington was not popular among the factory workers of the city, and they relished the opportunity to show their disgust. The mob pelted his train with rubbish, and several of them stormed onto the track. The trains were quickly turned round and exited the scene, but in the confusion it wasn't possible to turn 4 of the locomotives around, and they had to be left behind, while all the carriages were joined together and the remaining 3 engines towed them as one. The inaugural run hadn't gone as smoothly as had been hoped. Huskisson's death and the riot were widely reported in the papers, but this served as an example of the principle that all publicity is good publicity. Widespread reporting had helped make the concept of the railway known across the country. Crowds flocked to the new line, while many entrepreneurs and engineers looked into the potential of building their own locally. The great age of the railway had arrived. Thank you for watching my video. I hope this is a great improvement on the quality of the previous version of this same video. If you would like to see more, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to see examples of my artwork, please look at the links to my website and Etsy pages in the comments below. I am currently working on part 8 of this series. It should be with you in the next couple of months. I shall see you then.